In 535 and 536 AD, mankind was hit by one of the great natural disasters of our history. Much of the light and heat from the sun was cut off for 18 months, and the climate of the entire planet was changed. As a direct or indirect result, climate chaos, famine, migration, war, and enormous political change occurred on virtually every continent. The climate also affected people from Afro-Eurasia. This is from Britain to Mongolia, from Scandinavia to South Africa, China, Korea, Japan, Mesoamerica, South America. The disaster altered world history dramatically and permanently, and it's why we're speaking English today. The 100-year period afterward is the heart of the Dark Ages. This is the interface between the ancient and modern world. The period witnessed the downfall of the super-cities of the ancient world, the end of ancient Persia, the transmutation of the Roman Empire into the Byzantine Empire, the end of ancient South Arabian civilization, the end of Catholicism's rival, Arian Christianity, the collapse of the greatest ancient civilization of the world, the metropolis state of Teotihuacan, fall from power of the great Maya city of Tikal, and the fall of the Nazca civilization of South America. This is the civilization that makes the giant monkeys and spiders in the desert. In Tikal, we can see a dramatic change in leadership. This type of rapid turnover in leaders isn't a positive sign that things are going well. This 100-year period after 535, 536 AD, we see the origin of Islam, France, Spain, England, Ireland, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Cambodia, and the rise of the Turkic power. We also see China becoming united for the first time, and the great South American empires that ultimately become the Incas. The climate disaster, however, destroyed the Roman Empire. The hordes of the Central Asian barbarians turned against Europe as they were forced out of Asia by the drought, and a series of killer epidemics, plagues, that reduced the world's population substantially, about 30% in Europe alone. In Britain, the period of 535 to 555 was the worst weather of that century. In Mesopotamia, heavy falls of snow and distress among men were reported. In Arabia, there was famine, followed by flooding. In China, in 536, there was a drought and famine, in which yellow dust rained down like snow. Now, this still happens today occasionally in China from dust storms, but in this case it wasn't that. The following year the crops were ruined again, this time by snow that occurred in the middle of August. Across the sea in Japan, the emperor issued an edict stating that yellow gold and 10,000 strings of cash cannot cure hunger. Wealth was no use to a man who was starving of cold. In Korea, 535 and 536 were the worst years of that century in climatic terms, with massive storms and flooding followed by drought. In the Americas, the pattern was similar. In the 530s, a 32-year-long drought started that devastated parts of South America. In North America, tree-ring evidence from what is now the western United States demonstrates that some trees virtually stopped growing in the years of 536 and 542 to 543, and they didn't really return to normal until 559. Similar tree-ring evidence from Scandinavia and Western Europe also revealed huge decreases in tree growth in the years of 536 to 542, again not recovering until much later in the 550s. With some people began in the head, made the eyes bloody and the face swollen, descended to the throat, and then removed them from mankind with others. There was a flowing of the bowels. Some came out in buboes, which gave rise to great fevers, and they would die 2 or 3 days later with their minds in the same state as those who had suffered nothing and with their bodies still robust. Others lost their senses before dying. Sometimes people were afflicted once or twice and then recovered, only to fall victim the third time and then succumb. This is written by the 6th century church historian Evagrius. The plague first hit Egypt and the Mediterranean port of Pelusium, spreading to Alexandria, Constantinople, and the empire as a whole. Up to 30%, about a third of the empire's population died in the first outbreak, and in the capital more than 50% of the people were thought to have perished. John of Ephesus wrote, "God's wrath turned into a winepress and pitilessly trampled and squeezed the inhabitants like fine grapes. Homes large and small, beautiful and desirable, suddenly became tombs for the inhabitants, and in which servants and masters at the same time suddenly fell dead, mingling in their rottenness together in their bedrooms. Everywhere one looks were corpses which split open and rotted on the streets with nobody to bury them. There were those who perished falling in the streets, to be a terrible and shocking spectacle for those who saw them, as their bellies were swollen and their mouths wide open, throwing up pus like torrents. Their eyes inflamed, their hands stretched out upward and over the corpses, people rotting and lying in corridors and streets and in the porches of courtyards and in churches. There were ships in the midst of the sea, whose sailors were suddenly attacked by God's wrath, and the ships became tombs adrift on the waves. These are the legendary ghost ships, crewed by dead people. It happened that 5,000, 7,000, 12,000, as many as 16,000 of them departed in a single day. Thus far it was only the beginning. Men were standing by the harbors, at the crossroads, and at the city gates counting the dead. Thus the people of Constantinople reached the point of disappearing. Only a few remaining, whereas those who had died on the streets, if anyone wants to name their number, for a fact there were counted. Over 300,000 were taken off the streets, those who counted having reached the number of 230,000, and seeing that the dead were innumerable, gave up reckoning, and from then on the corpses were brought out without being counted. The city stank with corpses, as there were neither litters nor diggers, and the corpses were heaped up in the streets. Some victims would take days to die, while others became ill and died within minutes. The church historian Evagrius lived through 4 great epidemics and lost most of his family to them. It was in the year 593 he wrote down a personal lament, a personal sadness. I believe no part of the human race to have been unafflicted by the disease, for it occurred in some cities to such an extent that they were rendered empty of almost all of their inhabitants. During the course of the various visitations, I lost to the disease many of my children and my wife and much of the rest of my kin. For now, as I write this, I'm 58 years old, and it is not quite 2 years since the 4th outbreak of the plague struck Antioch, and I lost my daughter and the son born to her, in addition to those I lost earlier. Where does it come from? Evidence that the 6th century plague originated in Africa rather than Asia is clear. Firstly, the population center of Asia, China, did not become infected until half a century after the Mediterranean region. China was infected from the Mediterranean region via the Middle East. Second, there's no evidence of plague being endemic to the Central Asian steppes prior to the latter medieval period. Third, the major contemporary source, the Syrian-born historian Evagrius, actually records the epidemic came from Africa, in particular Ethiopia. Why did the plague break out of its animal reservoir in East Africa at this particular time? Modern research on wild animal reservoirs of plague, monitored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, concludes that most plague outbreaks are caused by a sudden and severe climate change. Massive, excessive rainfall is the most likely cause of plague spread, especially if it follows a drought, although a severe drought followed by normal weather could theoretically also start an outbreak. When there's excessive rainfall, vegetation increases, providing more food for herbivorous animals and insects. Rodents, including those that are carriers of the plague bacterium, but are themselves immune to it, therefore breed more. Their larger numbers enable a greater survival rate compared to those slower breeding predators that eat them. So this is a spreadsheet or chart that illustrates the relationship between gerbils and a number of other species with humans, and how the plague might be transmitted from one to another. The species in East Africa that are probably the reservoirs for the plague are gerbils and multi-mammate mice. Each gerbil can produce 10 offspring per year, while each multi-mammate mouse pair can produce 1,000 descendants per year. These two species spread the disease to the rat-like Arvacanthes, which would come into contact with the black rat, Rattus rattus. The black rat likes to hang out with humans on farms, storehouses, houses, villages, towns, markets, ports, and ships. Now, the multi-mammate mouse indicates the female has many mammae or breasts, up to 12 pairs of them, which is far more than any other mammal can boast, and it's enough to support the average litter of 8 to 10 babies. The Roman Empire imported up to 50 tons of ivory every year from East Africa. This required the killing of about 5,000 elephants per year, worth the equivalent of about $400 million today. Between the years 400 and 540 AD, of the estimated 400,000 major ivory artworks made, about 120 survive. From the period 540 to 700 AD, only 6 survive. Ivory business, therefore, had collapsed. In Central Asia, the Avars were displaced to the west by climate change. They were driven by drought to the west. where they ran into the Roman Empire. Generally every year, the Avars demanded a payoff, lunch money, and the Romans would hand it over, and that would be that. For 30 years, the empire had been paying protection money to the Avars, about 30,000 pounds of gold. The plague killed about a third of the population / tax base of the Romans. Therefore, they can't come up with the same amount of money. This brings instability. In 602, the Roman army mutinied. The emperor was killed. His head was put on display. The army began to split up, and the Persians attacked. Phocas, the new leader of Rome, had a reputation for being a psychopath. He was into torture, jealousy, crazy behavior. Finally, he was overthrown and burned alive. So how did all this start? We have craziness in continental Europe. This craziness started a little bit further to the west. Mediterranean writers refer to a severe dry fog or dust veil in 536. Later, this was interpreted to be the result of a volcanic eruption, probably near Sumatra, possibly Krakatoa, sending dust and acid into the stratosphere. Here's a chart. You'll see a few of these now that illustrate the major events of the 6th century. And you'll see a clustering of stuff starting all around 535 AD, including strange colored rain, famines, epidemics, droughts, disease, bad stuff. This plume could explain the crop failures and famines, which are also recorded around the world in the late 530s. Tree rings were very narrow, and the two traditional dates for Arthur's death are 539 and 542 AD, prime time for this whole catastrophic series of events. Arthurian legend provides more backing for this idea. Arthur, it's believed the name comes from Artur, which is Welsh for the bear, kind of a gang leader, the Tupac of Western Britain at the time. Arthur is an Apollo figure, a bright god who fires arrows and brings plague. In this case, the Justinian plague, which was probably as bad as the Black Death, breaks out in Constantinople in 542 AD. Arthur isn't a classical god. He's believed to be a Celtic god, kind of like the Irish god or hero Cuchulainn, a rebirth of the Celtic god Lugh. The description of Lugh also provides a suggestion that maybe this whole event was started by a comet instead of a volcano. Now, Lugh is famous from a story called The Fate of the Children of Turin, which describes him as having a face as bright as the setting sun, too bright to look at. Another clue comes from a question asked by the Irish king Bress. In surprise, he asked the Druids why the sun should be rising in the west, the direction from which Lugh was approaching, when every other day he rises in the east. The Druids say that it's the splendor of the face of Lugh Lav Fada. Lav Fada means of the long arm, or a long reach, and therefore Arthur is a rebirth of the bright-faced god, as bright as the setting sun, who is named for his long arm, his long reach, who comes up in the west. And this sounds like an approaching comet. Lugh is said to carry a fiery spear, and he lets fly 3 throws that are associated with a great mist, darkness, and thunderous noise. Its effects can be gauged by another look at an Arthurian legend, which is closely linked to the Grail legend. The Grail legend comes with the concept of a wasteland, where no crops grow and the land is infertile. It refers generally to England. Question is, was there a wasteland at around AD 540? It seems like there was. The trees certainly show it. The humans show it in their descriptions of the famines and the plagues, and even the magician, Merlin, fits the interpretation. Looking back now at artifacts recovered from contemporary Britain, he's contemporary at this time, Western Britain was wide open to plague infection. Now, they were trading widely with people around the Mediterranean who were in contact with people in East Africa. Therefore, the plague has an easy conduit from East Africa to Cornwall. And on the other hand, the Anglo-Saxons were not trading with anybody. Nobody liked the Anglo-Saxons. So they were spared the plague because nobody liked them. Nobody would associate with them. And this results in the Anglo-Saxon expansion. As the plague wipes out the Celts, the Anglo-Saxons merely move into their territory. The archaeological evidence suggests that even Kent, which is just across the English Channel from France, started regular trade with the European mainland in the 580s or 590s. So it was a half a century after this disaster that the Anglo-Saxons started trade with continental Europe. And we find very few of these continental coins around Kent that were minted before 570 AD. So trade wasn't occurring. But in the West, Western Britain was busy trading with not only the continent, but also the Mediterranean region. We could assume direct shipping links with southwestern France, Spain, and more or less direct or indirect links with North Africa, Greece, and Asia Minor. Much of British-ruled West, Celtic-ruled West of what today is the UK, was devastated. The Anglo-Saxons in the East were not, and therefore, being spared by the plague, they were free to take over the recently vacated territory. Thus, this is when Wales was born. And this also explains why places like Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall, in addition to Ireland, still have remnants of their language and culture, the Celtic language and cultures, whereas in the East it's been essentially wiped out. So the net result is England is born, and we can say that the plague generated England, and it also spread the culture and language of England. The period of 538 to 553 was almost a complete disaster for Ireland. The worldwide climatic chaos of the mid-530s led in Ireland to crop failure and famine. This was known as the failure of bread. The Annals of Ulster say that there was a failure of bread in 538. This crop failure was part of a particularly severe overall disruption of plant growth that we can see clearly in the tree ring record from 536 to 540. In the earlier mid-540s, an epidemic broke out. Irish sources provide two conflicting dates for the disaster. One of them gives a date of 541, suggesting that the epidemic, maybe smallpox or a similar disease, was triggered by the 538 famine. So weakness induced by the famine leads to a spread of a pandemic. This is common throughout human history. And this brings us to the golden age of Ireland. More likely it started on the date provided by the Annals of Ulster in 545. In that year, both France and Spain were already infected with plague, and it's probable that it spread to Ireland from either of these areas or directly from the Mediterranean. But it was going to get worse. In 550, Ireland was engulfed by a second epidemic, this time almost certainly the plague, meaning the Black Death, referred to in the annals as the Mortalitas Magna, the Great Death. This disease probably wiped out a substantial portion of the population, including a large element of the relatively small literate and governing elite. So the best and the brightest of Ireland were wiped out in greater proportions than the common folk at this time. And this is a destabilizing effect. Also at this time, we see the rise of Islam. They were wicked, and so we sent them the flood of Aram. And in exchange for their 2 good gardens, gave them 2 gardens bearing a bitter fruit. They wronged themselves, therefore we scattered them abroad, a total scattering. Flood and subsequent scattering of the wrongdoers almost certainly refers to a historic event, a well-known historic event, the destruction of the greatest dam of the ancient world, that of Marib in Yemen. Until the mid-6th century, Yemen had been the most powerful political force in the Arabian Peninsula. Destabilization of the world's climate in the second half of the 530s and the 540s caused 2 disasters to hit Yemen. First, the bubonic plague devastated the population from 539 or 540 onward, and then the agricultural economy, a key part of the country, was destroyed by the collapse of the dam. Now, this dam wasn't one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but it probably should have been. It was the largest, or one of the largest and most spectacular engineering feats in pre-modern times, about 53 feet high, nearly a half a mile long, and 200 feet wide at the base. The job of this dam was to concentrate floodwaters so that they reached a particular height, and then once they reached that height, they can be focused into channels of an irrigation system consisting of hundreds of miles of canals. In total, the complex irrigated about 24,000 acres and supported a population between 30 and 50,000 people. Now, here's another flowchart of bad things that happened. In this case, the consequences of AD 535 for Islam, the Avars, plague, and the Roman Empire. So these events all fit in with the prophecies of Muhammad, prophecies of the Christians and the Jews. Persian War of 605 to 630 was seen in supernatural terms, much more so than previous wars. And thus the emergence of Muhammad was seen as a sign of the end of the world and the coming of the Messiah. Thus, Islam emerged directly out of the apocalyptic atmosphere of the period. Now in China, with 20% of the world's population, yellow dust rained down like snow. This dust could be scooped up by handfuls. Crops failed for at least 2 years, with snow falling in the summer. In 538 AD, there was an amnesty of rents and taxes. In the Shanxi province, there was a great famine, and the people practiced cannibalism, with 70 to 80% of the population succumbing to the disease and famine. Korea and Japan experienced climate problems that generate famine and ultimately disease, and subsequently the destabilization and reconfiguration leads to the creation of the modern countries of Korea, China, and Japan. Again, another flowchart of disasters, in this case for China. And Central America. These are some of the great city-states of the Maya Empire. They suffered a series of similar events without the bubonic plague, fortunately, at least for Central and South Americans. We went down, I took a group of students, about 16 years ago, down to Mexico to core one of these freshwater lakes in the Yucatan Peninsula. This is from another study by a different group of people, but it shows the same thing. And you notice that around 535 AD, we have a severe drought hitting the Yucatan in Mexico. So this is borne out by isotope values of mud. In Ireland, St. Patrick had died, and a new group of missionaries was traveling about, permanently Catholicizing the island. This is an example of the architecture from the 500s. These are known as beehive huts. This is in the southwestern of Ireland. These are 1,500 years old, and they're still dry inside because of the way the rocks are stacked.